Now, the Democratic National Committee fundraising in the wake of tragedy as 2020 Democrats step up their criticism of President Trump. Welcome to a brand new hour of America's Newsroom. It is Tuesday morning. I'm Sandra Smith.
And I'm Rick Leventhal in for Bill Hemmer. The DNC sending out fundraising emails to fight gun violence, and Democratic contenders blasting the president at a forum in San Diego.
His rhetoric contributes to this notion that it almost legitimates people coming out from under the rocks. This is terrorism of a different sort, but it's still terrorism.
Immigrants specifically, who is described as rapists and criminals, warning of an invasion, talking about an infestation. He is in large part responsible for what has taken place here.
The attack that we saw in El Paso 2 days ago was the result of hate and bigotry. Donald Trump has made hate and bigotry and division a political strategy.
Meanwhile, the New York Times changing this headline on the president's remarks after it sparked fierce backlash from Democrats. Alicia Acuna has more as the president prepares to head to El Paso tomorrow and Dayton a bit later on this week. Alicia, good morning.
Good morning, Sandra. And you just heard some of it right there. 2020 Democrats accusing the president of forwarding hate against minorities in San Diego at what was billed as the country's largest conference for Latinos. 5 in the Democratic field used the shootings as reason to choose them.
Together, we are going to undo the damage that Trump has caused and bring our nation back together again.
President Trump heads to El Paso and Dayton, Ohio tomorrow. The mayor of El Paso, who has voiced his opposition to Mr. Trump in the past, said of the visit he will greet the president as part of his official mayoral responsibility. The suspect in the El Paso massacre wrote in a so-called manifesto he was responding to a, quote, Hispanic invasion of Texas. Here's former Vice President Joe Biden last night.
Oh, no, there's no question it's a dangerous game. There's no question that his rhetoric has contributed to, at a minimum, of dumbing down the way in which we as a society talk about one another.
The president's address to the nation, in which he called for stricter gun laws and condemned racism, was met with fierce criticism by candidates. Senator Elizabeth Warren tweeting, quote, "And we need a president willing to take executive action herself. I'll do everything I can, and I'll lead the fight for gun legislation from the White House." The White House responding this morning on Fox and Friends.
She's raising money in an email appeal talking about the mass shooting. This is a disgrace, and if nobody else is going to talk about it, I'm going to talk about it. The president did not respond in kind. They politicized this over the weekend. They all blamed him, and I want to name and shame them now.
And Mr. Biden will be in Colorado tonight for a fundraiser. Sandra?
Alicia Acuna, thank you. Let's bring in our A-team. Jessica Tarlov is here, Fox News contributor. Amos Snead, Executive Vice President of AdFair-O, and former press secretary to House GOP Whip Roy Blunt, and Heather Hansen, trial attorney. Welcome to all of you this morning. As we anticipate now the president's departure this week, he'll be heading down to El Paso and a bit later on to Dayton. How will his visits be received, considering there are many Democrats already saying don't come here?
Absolutely. I think if you look at this, we're in now a year out from the election. So I think any news item, good, bad, ugly, pretty, is going to be used as an opportunity to fundraise, and it's going to be used as an opportunity to grab the media's attention. And I think that's what we're seeing both sides do. Of course, the president needs to go down there, and of course, the opposition is saying, we don't want you here.
If the president didn't go, he'd be criticized for that. But now that he's going, he's being criticized for that.
Absolutely. I mean, you can't win either way. There's going to be a faction that's going to be unhappy with no matter what type of action he takes. I think from a legal perspective with all of this stuff, it's a situation where both sides has strong points, and it's getting the evidence, more information to support it that's going to be helpful.
Jessica?
On the fundraising part, I actually don't like individual candidates.
Hold on, wait, hold on. To first address the reception of the president heading to both of these places.
I'm happy to address it all. I agree with what's been said so far. He absolutely has to go, and they have a right to be unhappy about receiving him and to say exactly to him what they think about the role of his rhetoric in these attacks, especially in El Paso. And for that, to go on. It is his duty as President of the United States of America to try his best to console people and to show up in times of need. And it is their First Amendment right to say whatever they want right back to him. It happened to the Republican governor of Ohio when he showed up at a vigil in Dayton. They were screaming at him, "We need action now.
Some would say that's the very rhetoric that they're wishing would go away." You want to transition to the fundraising. Let's pull up Elizabeth Warren's fundraising email, because you just heard Kellyanne Conway referencing that.
Right.
If we're going to address the gun violence epidemic in our country, this is her fundraising email, we need to take back the Senate in 2020. I'll fight my heart out to make sure Democrats win up and down the ballot in 2020. But if we're going to beat Republicans and the gun lobby, it's going to take a grassroots movement. Is that okay?
What I think is okay is fundraising for specific groups. So I think if you are for gun control groups like Moms Demand or Everytown, I think that's fine. I think raising for your own candidacy doesn't feel as good to me. Kamala Harris did it as well. So if you are pushing dollars towards groups that are on the ground working to make sure that we get assault weapons off the streets and that people like these shooters don't have these kinds of weapons, I'm all for it.
Inappropriate, too soon?
I think if you look at this, I mean, of course they're fundraising on this. They're running for the highest office in the land. And in the United States, that requires a lot of money. So you're looking at all of these different campaigns. They're going to fundraise on good news. They're going to fundraise on bad news. It's just a constant cycle of today's politics.
So my question is always, where are the funds going? You know, I'm a lawyer. I can take two sides of either argument. I can see both sides of this argument. But we don't know what the data shows, what the research shows, because we don't know what works. We need more money into what laws actually work here. And if they're giving the money to the candidates as opposed to these organizations, we don't know where that money is going.
As an attorney, I want to ask you about this potential for a federal hate crime being charged against the shooter in El Paso. What kind of difference does that make, and how tough is that to prove?
In this situation, it's not going to be very difficult to prove. He wrote this manifesto, which makes it very clear that he was going after immigrants, Hispanics. But in this case, Rick, it really doesn't make a difference because he killed so many people that he'd be facing the death penalty anyway. Hate crimes are important when it's a smaller scale crime, like someone kicks a stroller because the baby is of a different descent. In those situations, you can get a bigger sentence because it's a hate crime. Here, the only thing it does is allow for more research, more data, all of that stuff that we need in order to figure out what's going to work to help with these types of problems.
Strikes me that every one of these mass shootings is a hate crime. I mean,
well, if you're not targeting a minority group, it doesn't count that way.
Let's get the facts in here. FBI definition of a hate crime: criminal offense against a person or property motivated in whole or in part by an offender's bias against a race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity.
Right. It has to be a protected class.
Right.
So that's why the El Paso shooter that did make it clear in the manifesto that he was going after Hispanics would count. We don't know as much about the Dayton shooter right now, but it seems that it was quite indiscriminate and that he wanted to kill people, killed even his sister.
Well, and that's also why we talk about domestic terrorism. And domestic terrorism is defined under federal law, but it's not a specific law. And some argue that there should be a specific law so that we can pursue those cases with the same research and data that we do hate crimes. So this is all sort of crosses over each other. But ultimately, in this situation, whether or not this is a hate crime is not going to make an impact on the ultimate sentence.
Something else for which the president is taking some heat is for his reference to mental illness. In his words from the White House yesterday, saying that mental illness and hatred pulled the trigger, not the gun. Here's the president on that yesterday.
We must reform our mental health laws to better identify mentally disturbed individuals who may commit acts of violence and make sure those people not only get treatment, but when necessary, involuntary confinement. Mental illness and hatred pulls the trigger, not the gun.
Why is that being criticized?
Well, even the American Psychological Association has criticized this. I think what people mean when they say mental illness is they mean that's sick or depraved, that you can't imagine anyone in their right mind in a colloquial conversation feeling that way. Also, when the president goes on to say we're going to seek the death penalty for this, does he mean that every one of these shooters is going to be found not guilty on the basis of insanity? Yeah. And that isn't what's going to happen here. It's one of the things that the NRA and Republicans have been using for years, even though they don't want to fund mental illness programs under the ACA, I would add there. But it is one of the things that, at least as a Democrat and coming from a pro-gun reform perspective, I see as a way of scapegoating this. And it does significant damage to the community of people who actually suffer from mental illness. They do not go out and get a gun and shoot dozens of people. That is not what it means to be mentally ill.
But that doesn't mean that these people who do that
But a very
aren't
small
mentally
number
ill.
of them actually have, statistically speaking. I believe it's only 2 mass shooters in American history have actually had technical mental illness.
Heather, I want you to respond, but since she keeps bringing it up, the American Psychology Association did put out this statement, routinely blaming mass shootings on mental illness is unfounded and stigmatizing. Research has shown that only a very small percentage of violent acts are committed by people who are diagnosed with or in treatment for mental illness.
Well, and that's true. I have a psychology degree, and we studied that, and we found out that people who are mentally ill are not more likely to commit acts of violence. Rick, you're right in that there was some sort of a mental issue with these shooters in order to bring them here, and we need to know what that is so that we can look at how we can prevent it. Things like depersonalization, that using the computers and being online and not having a society support. Things like radicalization and being more likely to jump on the bandwagon of some of these crazy websites. Those are the mental issues that we need to look into to prevent these. But ultimately, this young man is not going to be getting off, most likely, on not guilty by reason of insanity because his acts were so depraved, so thought out, so clear in his manifesto.
Just full disclosure, my father's a former president of the American Psychological Association. And just because someone hasn't been treated for mental illness or diagnosed with mental illness doesn't mean that they are not mentally ill. So I think, the statement it should be qualified a little bit.
I think if you look at this, I mean, this is a challenge we have as society as a whole. And whenever one of these disasters happens, we immediately start pointing fingers. Who can we blame? I actually agree that all of these options should be on the table. We have to come together as a country, as Republican, as Democrats to address this.
What about this red flag law proposal that, that would allow police and family members to take guns away from people who may have issues?
Well, and that's the problem, Rick, because we have a constitutional right to bear arms under the Second Amendment, and we talk about this here all the time. But that right is not without boundaries. And so the laws, we talk about these laws just sort of in a vacuum. We need to know what the laws do, what the laws say, what they allow for and what they don't allow for. Oftentimes we do know that most crime is local, and local authorities know best who in their community is the type of person that should have a gun taken away. I am a proponent of these laws, but we need to make sure that they are the least restrictive they can be to do what they need to do.
All right, now to the New York Times cover and then eventual replacement, because the New York Times late yesterday put out this headline trying to capture the president's words yesterday, the first since the shootings happened. He spoke at the White House.
Upper right there.
Trump urges unity versus racism. The Times was quickly criticized even by some 2020 Democratic presidential candidates and eventually many readers saying, I'll pull my subscription, because they thought that they had mischaracterized the president's word. He could not have possibly been urging unity, was their take.
So I work in strategic communications, and I think what this highlights is the daily 24/7 battle for influence in the media narrative in this country. I mean, you see a headline come out, and the New York Times reported what they believed was a factual representation of what occurred. And some Democratic candidates didn't like it, so they took to Twitter, and they were outraged by it. And as a result, you can see they are shaping the coverage. The New York Times did change that headline later in the day yesterday.
They sure did, Jessica.
Yeah, they did. I saw it when it came out, and I thought, that isn't at all what I feel about this. It was for those 9.5 minutes that he was speaking from a teleprompter, but the objection to it was that it didn't really speak to the entirety of what has gone on here. It didn't account for months and years of rhetoric that has found a home and support in communities like where this El Paso shooter came from, in that 8chan discussion board, people who do hate minorities, white supremacists, white nationalists, and that it wasn't doing justice to what the president had done, but also to the piece below. If you read it, it was by Alexander Burns, who's a wonderful reporter, and he actually did speak to the context of all of this. And we do know that often an editor writes the headline and the journalist or the reporter writes the piece. So there was clearly a miscommunication between the two things. I'm not canceling my subscription, but I do understand people being frustrated by it.
By the way, quickly, Rick, before we go, it was changed to this headline, assailing hate but not guns. Its website also showed a similar headline, Trump condemns bigotry but doesn't call for major new gun laws.
I'm just wondering how often that happens. How often do they change headlines?
Well, certainly not an A1 story. That's why this was such a big deal. It was above the fold, front page. You're not talking about something that's buried deep in there. This is the major story of the day. It should be correctly titled.
And arguably it's supposed to be fact and not opinion. There's a part of the paper that's meant for opinion, and the front page is meant for fact. And the headlines, it's difficult to put a headline that's perfect on both sides. But in this situation, I think that it wasn't so offensive that it needed to be changed. And that change just lends itself to more distrust of the media.
He did call for unity, and he did condemn racism.
Like I said, it was in those 10 minutes, we saw a very different president than we have at all of these rallies, when he said...
So was the headline flawed?
I think the headline was flawed, especially because it didn't reflect the content of the piece. I think
Amos, final thoughts for you.
I think the headline reflected his speech yesterday. The headline just did not sit well with some of the 2020 Democratic presidential candidates.
All right, A-Team, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Covered a lot there.
Well, U.S. officials are telling Fox News that North Korea has test-fired 2 more short-range ballistic missiles, its 4th such launch in roughly 2 weeks. Greg Palkot is live in London with more on this. Greg?
Hi, Rick. Yeah, a few differences with these launches. These missiles took off from the west coast of the country of North Korea. They traveled across the Korean Peninsula, ending up in the Sea of Japan. That makes the distance traveled about 280 miles, longer than some of the other missiles launched. There are also reports that these missiles and the others as well use solid fuel and are launched from mobile launchers, making them very hard to detect if defenses go after them from the south, from the United States. Also, it puts these missiles in range of just about all of South Korea's population centers as well as U.S. military bases. Now, Pyongyang clearly angered over the just started U.S.-South Korea joint military exercises. They are way scaled down from the ones that we've seen in the past couple of years, but North Korea is still angry today, saying, I'm quoting the state media, due to these drills, we are compelled to develop, to test, to deploy powerful means for defense. Still, Trump administration is continuing to take a low-key approach to these launches. Earlier today on Fox, National Security Advisor John Bolton said the president is watching, but doesn't feel that these shorter-range missiles violate any agreement he has with the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. We also heard from the Defense Secretary Mark Esper traveling in Asia. Here's a quick comment from him.
We're not going to overreact to these, but we monitor them, we watch them closely, and we're cognizant of what's happening.
Still, experts say they are watching and they are fully expecting North Korea to act up again. These U.S.-South Korea joint exercises, Rick, go on for the next 2 weeks or so. Back to you.
Greg Palkot in London. Why so many Republicans leaving office, and why so many from the Lone Star State?
Well, it's a very bad sign for the Republicans. Generally, Congress members will retire when they don't think they're going to win. And so those guys, those members are looking at their situation in Texas, in their particular districts, and saying, you know what, I'd rather go out voluntarily retiring than get beaten by a Democrat.
Is it that they're worried they won't win, or that they don't like being in the minority in the House?
Certainly they don't like being in the minority, and it's a combination of those two things. Texas has been trending purple. There's been a great worry for the Republicans that it's getting a little bit more Democrat, or perhaps rapidly getting more Democrat. The chances of the Republicans retaking the House, I think, now are getting slimmer and slimmer. And, you know, they would much rather be in power. But if they're not going to be in power, they don't want to even be in Congress.
It's tougher to keep a seat red or blue if an incumbent isn't running.
Right. Oh, absolutely. But it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If the incumbent gets out of the district, then it makes it far easier for the Democrats to take it. Even if they might actually have lost it by a slim margin, if the Republicans have retained it by a slim margin, it actually changes the equation and makes things better for the Democrats.
And how does this affect the presidential hopes for a re-election in 2020?
It affects it a lot. And the first thing is that this is actually a sign that things are bad in Texas for Trump. Now, I don't think that Texas will go blue in the 2020 presidential election, but clearly the departure of Republicans suggests that that's the way the state is trending.
That would be pretty remarkable if it did. Shootings, of course, are always politicized. We want to switch topics and talk about what happened in Texas and Ohio, and also what happened this morning with the New York Times, which posted a headline on Twitter that it later changed for the print edition. The original headline read, "Trump urges unity versus racism," after his remarks yesterday. The updated headline said, "Assailing hate, but not guns."
Right.
Why did they change the headline?
Well, they came under immediate pressure from the left, and specifically from various Democratic presidential candidates.
And that pressure forced them to change the headline?
Well, I don't know whether it did. I suspect that it weighed pretty heavily. It was an extraordinary thing because their original headline was a simple, straightforward quotation or news representation of what the president actually said. And then suddenly Beto O'Rourke and Cory Booker were saying it was a disgrace.
Let's read some of those headlines. Christian Gillibrand tweeted, "That's not what happened." And then Cory Booker tweeted, "Lives literally depend on you doing better. New York Times, please do." And AOC tweeted, "Let this front page serve as a reminder of how white supremacy is aided by and often relies upon the cowardice of mainstream institutions."
Yeah, it's remarkable to see the Democrats attacking the media. It presumably only counts as something bad when President Trump is attacking the media. But the thing that they didn't like is that it didn't feed into their agenda. They've been probably so used to the New York Times headlines actually fitting the left's and the Democrats' agenda on gun control that they were outraged when the first version didn't, and then the New York Times changed it.
But wasn't the first version a fair representation of what the president actually said?
Yes, exactly. And it was absolutely a fair representation. He condemned hatred and racism. And, you know, the Democrats were suggesting that somehow or other this should be interpreted or analyzed in the headline. That was a straightforward news headline, and the context and the analysis should have been as in the actual story, not in the headline.
Hugo Gordon from the Washington Examiner, thanks for being here this morning.
Thanks very much for having me.
Okay.
Well, a shocking claim coming from a former Google employee.
When President Trump won in 2016, Google executives went up on stage right away and cried, literally tears streaming down their faces over the fact that President Trump won. They vowed that it would never happen again.
He is claiming the tech giant will try to ramp up the censorship to ensure Donald Trump loses the election. Is it time for Congress to step in? We'll discuss that next.
President Trump has taken a very strong move here, imposing these sweeping sanctions, putting a full block, a full freeze on all assets of all parts of the government of Venezuela. They're all strongly supportive of this new move, and I think there's a renewed sense of confidence here, a renewed determination that we have to see Maduro moved out of power.
That was National Security Advisor John Bolton this morning on the political crisis in Venezuela. The Trump administration imposing a freeze on the Maduro government's assets in the U.S., escalating pressure on Venezuela's disputed president to step down. Blake Berman's live at the White House with the latest on that. Blake, good morning.
Sandra, good morning to you as well. This is a step short of a full-on economic embargo against Venezuela. But as you heard the president's national security advisor, John Bolton, lay out there, these are, as he put it, sweeping sanctions. It definitely ratchets up the sanctions that are currently in place against Venezuela. A couple different components to this one. First off, as you laid out, this freezes the assets of Nicolas Maduro and those underneath him in the Venezuelan government here in the U.S. But this also lets foreigners and foreign entities know that should they do business with Maduro or those underneath him, they could potentially be hit with serious sanctions as well. Here is part of the executive order which lays out the president's thinking and the administration's thinking in all of this. It reads at one point, quote, "In light of the continued usurpation of power by Nicolas Maduro and persons affiliated with him, as well as human rights abuses and ongoing attempts to undermine interim President Juan Guaido and the Venezuelan National Assembly's exercise of legitimate authority in Venezuela." Now, while the focus is on Maduro, this also sends a warning to China and Russia not to engage with Maduro and those who he surrounds himself with. I asked Kellyanne Conway this morning if there was any sort of tipping point that led to the president making this decision at this moment. Watch.
Well, a tipping point is President Maduro, and the president's also warning China and Russia if he continued to support his regime that there could be consequences as well. It's no surprise the president has made very clear how he feels about Venezuela and who's the government that we recognize there.
About 45 minutes, maybe an hour from now, the National Security Advisor John Bolton will be speaking in Peru and will lay out the Trump administration's thinking for these additional sanctions. Sandra, keep in mind here, the U.S. hasn't applied this kind of pressure on anyone in the Western Hemisphere in about 30 years. And right now, on a sanctions front, on an economic sanctions front, this puts Venezuela at the same kind of level as Iran, Syria, and North Korea.
Developing situation there. Blake Berman, thank you.
Sandra, the bug is back, or it was, and it was green. I saw it. A trade war between China and the U.S. escalating at this hour after the Dow suffered its biggest drop of the year yesterday. So what happens when markets open minutes from now? There's the green bug right there. I see it. Maria Bartiromo will join us live in studio next to talk about that. Plus,
California now facing a new challenge over its attempt to block President Trump from the ballot there. So how residents are now fighting back.
All we're requiring is people that aspire to be president, it's not about one person, they have to disclose their tax returns.
Session, a bit of a bounce back this morning. The Dow is up 163 points after closing down 760 points yesterday for its worst single day point drop of the year, as the U.S. Treasury Secretary labels China a currency manipulator. And the president calling out Beijing for trying to steal our businesses and factories and hurt our jobs. Maria Bartiromo is the anchor of Mornings with Maria on FBN and Sunday Morning Futures. Fresh off your show this morning, Maria, where I know you were watching the futures all morning long. Here we are, a minute into trading, at least a little bit of a rebound after a big sell-off yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, I think some people looked at the sell-off yesterday and said, okay, you know, it is getting to be overdone. I mean, we do have an economy that's growing and doing well. For all intents and purposes, the U.S. calling China a currency manipulator doesn't really have any practical purpose. I mean, it's not like they're going to, you know, hit a switch and all of a sudden something changes. It's just basically telling Beijing, we know what you're doing, and we are going to act, and this is not ending anytime soon, unless you start protecting the currency and not allow it to fall the way you did. I mean, Beijing said they're going to start selling yuan today and next week in Hong Kong. So if you actually
support their currency.
No, to sell it, to weaken it. They're going to sell the yuan to weaken it. They basically said that. Even though they're saying this is not manipulating our currency, we are holding this currency and we are going to sell some of it.
So I guess I'm sorry, and I was confusing the two things, but then they do have measures to step in then and support the yuan, which they have said that they intend to do. So a lot of it is how much to believe that they tell us they're going to do.
That's
right, Maria?
bingo, spot on. Because the truth is you could say something, but that leads money managers who are in the market to know what you're doing, and they're going to do it. So then, of course, the spigots were open. And it's like the U.S. for years saying, look, we want a strong dollar and not do anything to actually support a strong dollar and just watch it fall. So Beijing is a currency manipulator. It's true. We all knew that. Finally, the U.S. decides, let's make it official. Tell Beijing they're going to have to do something to stop this, because, you know, with a cheaper currency, it's making Chinese products that much cheaper, and it's going to basically eliminate the tariff impact for China.
Boost their exports, in other words. So the Dow's responding with this 204-point gain today. The president's been tweeting, China's always used currency manipulation to steal our businesses. This is a president that has shown that he wants to be tough on China. He's followed through with that promise to be tough on China. As far as this currency manipulation claim by the Treasury Department, John Bolton this morning was explaining this does allow certain things to happen, like we can now go to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and report it as such. So there are things that can be done.
Yeah, it's sort of like a warning. Look, we're going to do everything you know we can do.
Right.
So for all practical purposes, nothing really changes other than Beijing knows, okay, they may very well take this further.
So there's a lot to take in here, because there's the Wall Street Journal this morning. Here's the editorial board. Trade war becomes currency war. So a lot of that uncertainty is what we saw in that sell-off yesterday. But then this morning, another opinion piece, and this was written by former Fed presidents. We know that Jay Powell, the current Fed president, the president has really been targeting Jay Powell as not doing the right things as the head of the Federal Reserve. America needs an independent Fed. The economy functions best when the central bank is free of short-term political pressures. That piece by former Fed presidents does not name Trump specifically, but you could read into it that they are taking him on and saying this should be an independent body. What did you make of that warning?
They are taking him on. That's exactly. They are absolutely referring to Donald Trump. They don't want the president to bully around Jay Powell, because the country does need an independent Fed. And I agree with that. You don't want the Federal Reserve to feel pressure to make a move in monetary policy because the leader of the free world wants him to. You want them to actually respond to economic conditions. But having said that, let's not forget what went on at the end of last year when Jay Powell was very clear about raising rates 3 times and unwinding the balance sheet. 6 months later to say, oh, we're going to be cutting rates is a clear indication I made a mistake. And I think that's what Jay Powell told the country when he started cutting interest rates. So you can't really blame the president all that for knowing that he made a huge mistake. He was raising rates and now he's cutting rates. Having said that, nobody wants the president to bully Jay Powell because you want to have an independent Federal Reserve. I think all of this worry about the Fed, this worry about Beijing, the currency manipulation, all underlines one more thing, and that is this China fight is not ending anytime soon. The president has been very clear. He's not going to allow China to keep stealing from us unless they actually make it a law in their books in China that it is unlawful to steal intellectual property from the West. I don't know how the president saves face and gets out of this without having substantial change, and Beijing wants to save face and doesn't want it to look like they're responding to Donald Trump.
I've got to leave it there, but do you think that a deal gets put off to post-election?
Yes, I'm not expecting a deal right now because the stakes are way too high. By the way, this sell-off, yeah, there's nervousness. It will sell more, but right now, it looks like yesterday was a bit overdone.
Got it. Maria Bartiromo every weekday morning on FBN. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sandra.
All right, we will have more, much more on this coming up next hour with our headliner. White House Director of Trade Policy Peter Navarro will be joining us live at 10:45 Eastern Time. Stay tuned for that.
There are new developments in the showdown over President Trump's taxes. 4 voters are now suing the state of California after Governor Gavin Newsom signed a bill requiring presidential candidates to release 5 years of tax returns to secure a spot on the state's primary ballot. William Lajeunesse is live in Los Angeles with more on this. William.
Well, Rick, to be president, the Constitution requires only 3 things: be 35 or older, born in the U.S., and live here for the last 14 years. But California is now adding one more requirement. The new law says unless President Trump or any other candidate fails to make public 5 years of tax returns, they don't get on the primary ballot in California. Now, former Governor Jerry Brown vetoed the bill, but Governor Gavin Newsom, a proud and perpetual thorn in the president's side, says voters need to see the returns to know if a candidate is prone to corruption.
They have to disclose their tax returns, address issues of self-dealing, conflicts of interest, requiring that regardless of political party. You choose to do the right thing. You could choose not to do the right thing.
But 4 plaintiffs in the conservative group Judicial Watch argue this presents a slippery slope. What's next? Each state requiring medical or mental health records, prescription drugs, what they bought on Amazon, searched on Google, their Facebook friends. Quote, California politicians, in their zeal to attack President Trump, passed a law that also unconstitutionally victimizes California voters, according to group president Tom Fitton. So will the law survive a challenge? Well, both sides, scholars say, have decent arguments. States have a right to ensure the integrity of their primary. But years ago, Illinois tried to override the state Democratic Party and dictate the state delegation. Supreme Court said no. Quote, the states themselves have no constitutionally mandated role in the selection of presidential and vice presidential candidates, and allowing each state to enforce their own law could, quote, seriously undercut or indeed destroy the effectiveness of party conventions. So the bottom line, Rick, even if
front of the back, there was a female inside that was at the closest point to the door, and she was in some pain. She said she had some back pain, but the car was smoking. And I just asked her to grab my arm so I could pull her out. So we got her out first, and then the driver ended up jumping out on his own.
Both people inside that vehicle are expected to be okay. It is unclear why the SUV drifted across that road.
Remarkable.
In one voice, our nation must condemn racism, bigotry, and white supremacy. We must stop the glorification of violence in our society. We must reform our mental health laws to better identify mentally disturbed individuals who may commit acts of violence. Mental illness and hatred pulls the trigger, not the gun.
Calls for action growing stronger following mass shootings in 2 American cities. President Trump urging social media companies to develop tools for spotting early warning signs and identifying potential mass shooters. Tom Dupree is a former Deputy Assistant Attorney General under President George W. Bush, and Ted Williams is a former police detective and a Fox News contributor. Let's start with Tom. What about this president's call for the Department of Justice to work with social media companies like 8chan, where the El Paso shooter posted a manifesto before he went on his killing spree?
I think it makes a lot of sense for the government to do whatever it can to identify in advance people who might commit these sorts of horrific acts. We've seen, unfortunately, from history that a lot of times these shooters really either announce their intentions in advance or at least give off a lot of signals that they might be contemplating some sort of atrocity like what we've seen occur over the last few days. And to the extent that law enforcement, the Justice Department can monitor websites, work with social media companies to basically raise a red flag if they see something troubling like this, I think it's all to the good, and it's an intriguing idea worth pursuing.
So there is software that could help isolate and identify troubling posts and then alert law enforcement.
Yes, you can look at that. There are a number of different techniques that they have developed that basically enable you to analyze people.